Story 1. The house wasn't haunted, it was occupied. The house wasn't cheap, but it wasn't suspiciously so either. No warnings were listed, no tragic history disclosed. It was just an old 2-story home that had been, according to the listing, vacant for some time. That should have been my first clue. Old houses are supposed to make noise. They creak, they settle, they breathe with the wind. But the first night in my new home was quiet. Too quiet. Felt like walking into a room right after a conversation has abruptly stopped. The air was thick with unspoken words. This house didn't breathe, it held its breath. I tried to sleep, telling myself the silence was a good thing. But around 2:14 in the morning, I heard it. Footsteps from the floor directly above me. They weren't frantic or rushed, and they weren't the aimless pacing of someone lost in thought. Each step was slow, deliberate, heavy. It was just the house settling, I told myself. Thermal expansion. But then the steps stopped, directly over my bedroom, and the silence that followed was somehow even louder. The next morning I knew I wasn't alone. It wasn't a violent haunting, not yet. Nothing was broken or thrown across the room. Instead, things were adjusted. A dining chair was turned slightly, facing the hallway. A book I'd left on the shelf was now sitting on the coffee table. The mirror in the bathroom was tilted downward, as if someone shorter had been looking into it. It was like someone had been tidying up after me, but doing a very poor job of it. It was unsettling, but strangely, I didn't feel threatened. Felt observed, watched. It was as if the house itself was learning my habits, my routines, memorizing my life. So I stayed. I was curious. The first voice came from the laundry room a few days later. It wasn't words, not really. It was just a whisper, a breath shaped with intention, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. I stood frozen in the hallway, straining to hear it again. When I finally built up the courage to peek inside the room, the dryer door, which had been wide open, slammed shut with a deafening bang. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. That's when the cold spots started appearing, not a general draft, but pockets of intense, unnatural cold. There was one on the main staircase landing, another at the doorway of the guest bedroom. And the most unnerving one of all was the one that followed me. It was always right behind me when I brushed my teeth, a freezing patch of air against the back of my neck. I never used the guest room. I kept the door shut and tried to ignore it, but I couldn't ignore the changes. Some mornings, I'd open the door to find new wrinkles on the perfectly made bed sheets. A distinct indentation would appear in the mattress, the shape of someone lying there, waiting quietly. Who or what was using my guest room? Desperate for answers, I bought an audio recorder and left it running overnight in the living room. The next morning, spent hours listening to the playback. Nothing, just the faint sound of traffic and my own restless tossing and turning. Then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., it came through clear as day. A voice. It spoke my name. It wasn't angry or threatening. It sounded familiar, like a forgotten memory. After that, the poltergeist became bolder. The house started reacting to my emotions. If I had a heated argument on the phone, doors would slam in other rooms. If I cried after a sad movie, the lights would flicker and dim. And whenever I laughed, a real, genuine laugh, everything would stop. The house would fall completely silent, as if it were listening, intrigued. I slowly began to understand that I wasn't dealing with a single ghost. There were remnants here, residual presences left behind like fingerprints. But something else was in charge. Something intelligent and aware was coordinating them. One night I woke up completely unable to move. My first thought was sleep paralysis. I'd had it before, but this was different. There was a pressure on my chest, not heavy, but intentional. It shifted, and I felt the distinct impression of a hand resting there as if testing my weight, testing to see if I would wake up. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I knew what it wanted. It wasn't my fear. It was my acknowledgement. So, the next day, standing in the middle of the living room, I spoke aloud to the empty space. "I know you're here." The temperature in the room dropped instantly. Then came the response, whispered from multiple directions at once, a chilling chorus. We were first. Driven by this, I dug into the town's archives. I found no record of a single great tragedy at the house. There were no dramatic events, no dark history. Instead, there were dozens of small ones. A long list of previous occupants who stayed only for a short time. People who moved in and then moved out just as quietly. People who, I realized, never complained. They just left. Back in the house, the rules established themselves without words. Don't enter the guest room after dark. Don't block the mirrors with furniture. And never, ever ignore the footsteps. When I broke a rule, something would move. Something would get closer. The mirrors were the worst. My reflection would sometimes lag a split second behind my actual movements. Other times, my reflection's smile wouldn't quite match my own. One evening, while washing my hands, I saw it. A figure standing behind me in the mirror. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the bathroom was empty. I looked back at the mirror, and for a horrifying second, the figure was still there, watching me before it vanished. One night, the house put on a show. As I sat reading on the couch, every single cabinet and drawer in the kitchen flew open at once. Not violently, but in perfect, silent unison. It felt less like a threat and more like a round of applause. They weren't trapped here. I realized they were nesting. This was their home. And then I saw the thing that was in charge. It wasn't a ghost. It appeared as an absence. A darker shape in the corner of the room where light seemed to bend and refuse to exist. It had no face, no form, just a pure, pressing awareness that pushed in on me from all sides. It didn't need to speak with a voice. Its thoughts echoed directly in my mind. This house remembers. Then came the offer. I could stay. I would be welcome. If I agreed to share, not the space, my body. That's when I finally understood. The ghosts, the whispers, the moving objects, they weren't haunting the house. They were hiding in it, hiding from the thing that truly owned it. My last night was a storm of activity. Objects floated in midair for a few seconds before dropping. Overlapping whispers swirled around me, and through it all, the dark entity watched from the corner, silent, waiting for my answer. The next morning, I packed a single bag and walked out the front door without looking back. The moment I crossed the threshold, the immense pressure I'd been living under for months lifted. The air behind me felt empty, almost relieved. But you don't leave a place like that cleanly. It follows you. Not the footsteps or the voices. What followed me were the memories, the little things. Sometimes I see my reflection hesitate in a shop window. I'll feel a sudden, inexplicable cold spot in my new apartment. It's the realization that the house was never the problem. It was just a place where they had all gathered. Even now, sometimes late at night, I'll notice my furniture has shifted. Just slightly, not enough to cause panic, just enough to remind me. So, a word of warning. If you ever find a house that feels quiet, but it's the kind of quiet that listens, run. It's already occupied. Thanks for listening, and please, be careful out there. Story 2. The ghosts only moved when I wasn't looking. The building was never advertised as haunted. It was described as stable. That word came up often in the listing. Stable wiring, stable structure, a stable environment. And that's what I wanted. I just wanted quiet, not peace. Exactly, just the absence of interruption. And the apartment delivered that immediately. Almost too immediately. The silence was so thick, you could feel it pressing in on you. It was a complete, total absence of sound. The first sign was in the kitchen. I walked in one morning in a chair. One of the cheap wooden ones I'd brought with me had shifted. It hadn't been dragged or knocked over. It was just adjusted, like someone had corrected its position by a few inches to make it line up perfectly with the edge of the table. Now, this was strange for a few reasons. I lived completely alone. No pets, no roommates. The windows were sealed tight, so there were no drafts strong enough to move a solid piece of furniture. And the weirdest part? The chair only ever moved when I wasn't in the room. I'd leave the kitchen, come back, and it would be in a slightly different, more orderly position. So I decided to test it. I took a coffee cup and placed it right near the edge of the kitchen counter. I even used my phone to take a picture, marking its exact position. Then I walked out, went to the living room for about 5 minutes, and came back. The cup was no longer on the edge. It was sitting perfectly centered on the countertop, a good foot away from where I'd left it. A pattern started to emerge. Things weren't being moved randomly or chaotically. They were being improved. Objects were made straighter, more balanced, more aligned. My messy stack of mail would be squared into a neat pile. The shoes I'd kicked off by the door would be sitting side by side, perfectly parallel. It was like living with the most obsessive-compulsive, invisible roommate imaginable. Then came the first sound. It was late one night. I was reading on the couch and I heard a soft thud right behind me. It wasn't the sound of something falling off a shelf. It was the sound of something landing. Gently, I spun around, heart pounding. Nothing was out of place. Nothing had fallen. But the feeling that something had just arrived in the room was overwhelming. The true breakthrough, if you can call it that, happened in the bathroom. I was washing my face, head down over the sink. When I lifted my head, I caught a flicker of movement in the mirror. It was in the reflection of the room behind me. For just a split second, I saw my towel rack, which was always a little crooked, straightening itself on the wall. The moment I turned my head to look directly at it, the motion stopped. The towel rack was perfectly level. The mirror had shown me a version of the room that was cleaner, more organized than the one I was actually standing in. My first thought was ghosts. It had to be. Residual energy. Old tenants who were neat freaks in life and were now continuing their work in death. That made a certain kind of sense. But then the changes became more deliberate. It went from tidying up to something else. Drawers I'd left closed would be open when I returned to a room. Cabinet doors would shut themselves. Pictures on the wall would realign themselves if I so much as brushed against them. It was never violent or scary in a traditional sense. It was always gentle, precise, a poltergeist with a flair for interior design. Then, one night, it touched me. I was asleep, and I felt a distinct pressure on my shoulder. It wasn't heavy or menacing, it felt corrective. Like someone was gently nudging me into a better sleeping position. I jolted awake, but the feeling was already gone. The room was still and silent. That's when I started to understand a fundamental rule of the house: never interrupted. The one time I did die, I walked back into the kitchen just as a cabinet was swinging shut on its own. The temperature in the room dropped sharply. It wasn't just cold, it was empty. The air felt thin, like all the warmth and life had been sucked out of it for a few seconds. Desperate for answers, I set up a small camera on a tripod in the living room. I pointed it at the whole space, hit record, and left the apartment for an hour. When I got back and reviewed the footage, my blood ran cold. The video was choppy. It jumped frames. My couch would be in one position, and then in the very next frame, it would be an inch to the left. The books on my coffee table rearranged themselves between moments. The movement was happening in the gaps, in the milliseconds between the frames the camera could capture. But that wasn't the worst part. I'd forgotten the camera also recorded audio. Put on headphones and listened closely. Underneath the hum of the refrigerator, there was something else. Breathing. Not one person, but multiple. Faint, controlled, rhythmic breaths. They were waiting. They were holding perfectly still while I was home, just waiting for me to leave so they could continue their work. It only spoke once. I had just finished setting up a new bookshelf, and I deliberately placed a book at a slight angle, just to see what would happen. As I walked out of the room, a whisper followed me. It was raspy, dry, and right by my ear. It said one word: incorrect. Incorrect, that's what it all meant. I had placed my objects wrong. I lived wrong. I was occupying the space inefficiently. My very presence was a disruption to the apartment's perfect order. I started to sense other presences too, not solid figures, just faint impressions in the corner of my eye. Shapes that shimmered and vanished. They weren't in charge. They felt more like assistants, a crew working under a single director. This thing, the entity behind it all, it wasn't a ghost. Ghosts remember the past. They're echoes of what was. This thing, it optimized for the future. It didn't care about who lived here before. It only cared about perfect, unshakable order. So I decided to resist. I intentionally misaligned a chair, pushed it right up against a wall. I blocked a doorway with a small table. The response was immediate and terrifying. I didn't even have to leave the room. Everything shifted at once. The chair scraped back into its proper place. The table slid away from the door. The entire apartment felt like it exhaled a sharp, angry breath. And then, on the bathroom mirror, words began to appear in the condensation from my shower. 5 words. Order is required. That's when I finally understood. The presences, the faint ghosts I sensed, they weren't haunting me. They were the caretakers. They were trapped here, forced to maintain the space for whatever this primary entity was. They were its servants. That night, I had a dream. I was standing perfectly still in the middle of the living room. I couldn't move a muscle. And all around me, the apartment arranged itself. Furniture slid into place. Walls shifted, ceiling lowered and raised until the dimensions of the room were perfectly harmonious. The entity didn't want to possess my body, it just wanted my compliance. It wanted me to become another perfectly placed object in its collection. I spent my final night there wide awake. I kept every single light on. I sat on the floor, not wanting to disturb the furniture. As the hours passed, every object in the apartment began to hum with a faint energy. A low vibration filled the air. It felt like they were all waiting for me to fall asleep, waiting for permission to move. I walked out at dawn. I didn't pack. I just left. As I closed the front door behind me for the last time, I felt a palpable wave of disappointment from the building. It wasn't anger, it was letdown. It's like a master craftsman whose project had been ruined. But it didn't end there. It followed me. Not the sounds, not the visible movement, the alignment. Sometimes I'll come home to my new place, and a picture frame will be perfectly straight when I know it was crooked. The pens on my desk will be arranged in a neat row. Things still shift, but only when I'm not looking. And sometimes I hear the ghosts, not their voices. It's more like a sudden pressure in the room, a spike of anxiety, a sense of urgent warning. They're trying to tell me something. They're trying to tell me that the real horror isn't that this entity needs a house to exist. The horror is that it just prefers one. I'm telling you this story for a reason, because if you ever notice that things in your home only move when you aren't looking, if objects seem to be a little too neat, a little too perfect, when you come back into a room, you're not alone. Something is correcting your space. And eventually, it will correct you. Thanks for listening. Story 3. The ghosts were afraid of the basement. When I first rented the house, the landlord gave me a strange piece of advice. He just said, "Everything upstairs works fine." He never once mentioned the basement. I didn't think much of it at the time. The basement door was always closed, the edges painted shut, sealed tight. There wasn't even a handle on the inside. It felt less like a room and more like a permanent boundary, a line you just don't cross. The ghosts showed up pretty early on. It started with small things, footsteps in the dead of night when I was the only one home, a sudden, unexplained cold draft that would drift through the hallways. In the most unsettling part, the sound of a child's laughter in a house where no child had ever lived. But these spirits were different. They were quiet, almost respectful. They seemed cautious, as if they were afraid of making too much noise. Then the activity escalated. Objects began moving on their own. I'd watch a glass slide slowly across the kitchen counter and fall to the floor. A picture frame on the mantelpiece would turn itself face down. Chairs in the dining room would rotate one by one to face the main staircase, but never ever toward the basement door. It was like they were drawing a line, keeping their distance from that one specific spot. One night, the strange occurrences took a more direct turn. I heard whispering coming from the living room. It wasn't just one voice, it was several, all overlapping. They sounded urgent, desperate, and they were all repeating the same single word, "Don't." The temperature in the room plummeted. Started seeing shapes flickering at the edge of my vision. These weren't hostile entities. I could feel their fear. They weren't trying to scare me. They were scared of something else. I discovered the basement's secret by accident. I was standing near the sealed door one afternoon when I felt the air move. It was a slow, rhythmic pulse. In and then out. It was like the slow, deep breathing of something enormous, sleeping just on the other side of the door. The house itself felt alive. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I decided to ask. I stood in the hallway and spoke out loud. "What's down there?" The reaction was immediate and violent. Every single light in the house flickered wildly. A plate in the kitchen shattered against the floor. And the whispers returned, but this time they were louder, more frantic. "Not down there," they hissed. A few nights later, I saw her. A young girl, pale and translucent, standing at the top of the stairs. She was completely still, just staring. She raised a trembling hand and pointed not at me, but directly at the basement door. Then, she slowly, deliberately shook her head. The message was clear: don't go near it. After that, the house became a chaotic mess of paranormal activity. Drawers would slam shut on their own. If I even walked toward the basement door, a loud, insistent knocking would start from inside the walls, as if in protest. The ghosts were no longer being subtle. They were actively trying to block me, to keep me away from that door. Their fear was now my fear. But what drew me in? It's the same thing that gets people in trouble in every horror story. Simple, unrelenting curiosity. I had to know what they were so afraid of. So one day I decided to open the door. I expected a struggle, but the painted seal broke with barely any effort. It was almost too easy. Smell wafted out, but it wasn't the smell of rot or decay I expected. It was a smell of absence, of complete and total emptiness, like a void that had never been filled with anything. I peered into the darkness and saw stairs leading down. They went down much farther than the foundation of the house should have allowed. Too many steps, disappearing into a pitch-black abyss. And then I felt it. What lived below wasn't a ghost. It had no memory of being human. It didn't haunt the house in the traditional sense. It just waited. It didn't make a sound, not a growl or a voice. Instead, a pressure began to build inside my head. It was a silent suggestion, a pull, a calm and reasonable thought that I should just come a little closer, just take one step down. In that instant, every spiritual presence in the house erupted. It was a scream, but not one you could hear with your ears. It was a psychic explosion of pure terror. I felt cold. Invisible hands grabbed my arms, trying to pull me back. Something shoved me hard from behind, and the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Then their voices flooded my mind, all overlapping, broken and desperate. "It eats what notices it," they pleaded. That's when I finally understood. The basement wasn't part of the house. The house was built on top of it, around it, as a cage. The ghosts weren't trapped here. They were the guards. The landlord's words finally made sense. Everything upstairs works fine, because upstairs was all that was left of the house. Downstairs was something else entirely. After that night, the ghosts changed. They didn't just haunt the periphery anymore. They watched me. They followed me from room to room, their presence a constant weight. It felt like they were measuring me, judging me, trying to decide if I could be trusted to keep the secret. When I finally moved out, the entire house seemed to sigh in relief. It felt lighter, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as I packed my last box. But the basement door remained, a silent, painted-over scar on the home. I left the ghosts to their eternal watch, but something followed me. Not the ghosts. It was a silence, a specific kind of silence that listens. And now, I have this recurring dream. I'm walking down a flight of stairs, endlessly counting each step, but I always lose track. The number is always wrong. I'm telling you this story for a reason, because some houses aren't haunted, they're sealed. They are containers for something far worse. So if the ghosts in your home seem scared, if they seem more afraid of something than they are of you, please listen to them. They know it's worse than being a ghost, and they're trying to keep it contained. Thank you for listening. Story 4. The spirits only spoke through the walls. When you live in an old building, you expect noise. It's the clanking of radiators, the hum of ancient pipes, the occasional argument from your neighbors bleeding through the thin walls. So when I first heard the tapping, I did what anyone would do. I ignored it. It was probably just the building settling, another quirk of its old age. But the tapping wasn't random. It had a pattern. 3 soft knocks, a short pause, and then 2 slower ones. And it was never from a door or a window. It always came from inside the walls. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a weird plumbing issue or a loose wire. But then I realized something unsettling. The taps followed me. I'd be in the bedroom, and I'd hear it from the wall behind my bed. I'd go to the bathroom, and the sound would start up from the wall beside the shower. In the kitchen, it came from the wall behind the stove. It was always close, always patient, like something was waiting just on the other side of the drywall, tracking my every move. One night, curiosity got the better of me. Tapping started again from the living room wall. 3 soft knocks, then 2 slower ones. I took a deep breath and knocked back, mimicking the pattern exactly, 3 taps. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than before. Then the wall responded to knocks, but this time they weren't soft. They were hard, sharp cracks that echoed through the room like knuckles hitting solid wood. Instantly, the air in the room changed. It grew cold, but not freezing. It was a still, heavy cold, the kind you feel when a room is holding its breath. I felt a prickling on the back of my neck. I wasn't alone. That night, things began to move. I was trying to watch a movie, pretending everything was normal, when I noticed a picture frame on the wall had tilted. Then, a glass I'd left on the kitchen counter slid slowly toward the edge and stopped, just shy of falling. I froze, my eyes wide. The most terrifying thing was the dining chair. It slowly, almost deliberately, rotated on its own, turning to face the very wall where the knocking had come from. Nothing broke, nothing was thrown. It was all so slow, so methodical. This wasn't a violent haunting. It felt like something was trying to get my attention. The next morning, I heard the whispers. They weren't coming from another room or from outside. The sound was faint, papery, and it was coming from inside the walls themselves. It sounded like dozens of voices, all layered on top of each other, speaking at the same time. I pressed my ear against the drywall, trying to make out what they were saying. It was a jumble of sounds, a chaotic murmur. Then through the static, one clear word cut through the noise. Listen, I needed to know more about this place. I went down to the city archives, hoping to find some history on the building. The records were a mess. They were old, incomplete, and full of gaps. I found mentions of renovations, lists of unnamed tenants who came and went, but nothing that explained what was happening. Several floors were marked as reconfigured in old blueprints, with no further explanation. It was a dead end. Back in the apartment, feeling defeated, I walked over to the wall that had knocked back. I don't know why I did it, but I placed my palm flat against the cool surface. And then it happened. The wall pushed back. It was a slight pressure, barely perceptible, like the wall was breathing. But it was enough. It was real. Snatched my hand away, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers continued, and I started to understand them better. The voices weren't aggressive. They sounded tired, exhausted. They repeated phrases, fragments of conversations, like echoes of memories that had been worn thin over time. "He's coming," one would say. "Don't let him in," another would murmur. They were ghosts, I realized, trapped in a loop. But as I listened more, I noticed something strange. The whispers came from every wall of the bedroom, the kitchen, the living room, all except one. They were actively avoiding the wall that my apartment shared with what looked like a sealed-off stairwell. I'd never paid much attention to it before. It wasn't on the building's floor plan. It was just an outline on the wall, a narrow doorway that had been plastered and painted over so many times you could barely see it. There was no handle, no hinges, just the faint shape of a door. What was in there? And why were the spirits so afraid of it? That night, the tapping became frantic. It wasn't just one wall anymore. It was all of them, all at once. A chorus of desperate, urgent knocking filled the apartment. And the whispers, they were louder now, clearer, all saying the same thing over and over. Don't open it. They weren't just warning me. They were begging. And then something else answered. It wasn't a tap. It was a low, deep vibration that started in the floor and traveled up through the walls, through the furniture, through my own bones. It was a hum that seemed to resonate in my skull, a feeling of immense pressure and ancient power. This wasn't one of the ghosts. The ghosts were memories of life. This felt different. This thing remembered space, the emptiness between floors, the darkness inside the walls. Suddenly, the poltergeist activity escalated. Furniture began to slide across the floor, not slowly this time, but with force, as if being pushed by an invisible crowd. The lights flickered violently. The picture frames didn't just tilt, they were knocked to the floor. The ghosts were trying to barricade the sealed door. The whispers broke. They were no longer just fragments. They were cries, begging, sobbing, apologies overlapping in a terrifying wave of sound. And in their panic, I finally understood. They hadn't died in this building. They had hidden here. They had sealed themselves inside the walls to get away from whatever lived in that stairwell. I looked at the painted-over door. The outline was pulsing, a faint rhythmic in and out, like a chest breathing. With each pulse, fine dust fell from the edges like flaking skin. The thing in the stairwell wasn't trying to get in. It didn't need to. It wanted something else. It wanted to be acknowledged. Taking a shaky breath, standing in the middle of the chaos, I spoke out loud. My voice was small, trembling. "I know you're there." The effect was instantaneous. The walls went silent. The furniture stopped moving. Every whisper, every cry, every echo retreated into nothingness. The ghosts were gone. But the vibration intensified. The pressure in my skull became immense. There were no words, no sounds, but a message formed in my mind, clear as day. Make room. I didn't wait for a second invitation. I ran. I grabbed my keys and my phone and bolted out of the apartment, not even bothering to close the door behind me. As I sprinted down the hallway, I heard one last sound from my apartment. Every wall knocked once. Single, loud, resonant thud, all in perfect unison. A farewell. Weeks later, the building was condemned. The official report cited structural instability. There was no mention of voices or moving furniture or a stairwell that breathed. I moved to a new place, a modern building with thin, quiet walls. But sometimes when I'm in a room alone and it's completely silent, I hear it. 3 soft taps. Pause. 2 slower ones. Always nearby, always patient. I finally understood the truth. The ghosts weren't haunting the building. They were reinforcing it. They were a part of its structure, a living warning system. Walls don't just separate rooms. They separate things that should never, ever meet. So if your walls ever start talking, if they ever answer back when you knock, listen very carefully. They might not be trying to scare you. They might be trying to keep something else away. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe for more. Stay safe out there. Story 5. The spirits only appeared during power outages. My neighborhood had a strange problem. Power went out all the time. There were never any storms, no fallen trees, no car accidents involving a utility pole. It was just sudden, complete blackouts. They never lasted long either. 10 minutes, maybe less. Most of the time, it was just a few moments of total, unnerving darkness. You'd think people would complain, right? Call the power company, demand answers, but no one did. The reason was simple. When the power came back, it came back perfectly. There was no flickering, no surge. The digital clocks on our microwaves and ovens never even reset. It was as if the outage was a brief pause in reality, a slice of time that was neatly cut out and then seamlessly stitched back together. It was easy to pretend it never happened. The first time I saw them, I was in my kitchen, getting a glass of water. The lights just died, not a flicker, just gone. I was plunged into that familiar, absolute darkness. But this time was different. In the pitch black, I saw movement. Faint, shimmering shapes were forming where the walls of my kitchen should have been. They weren't solid, just outlines against the void, and the silence. It was the most profound silence I'd ever experienced. The usual hum of the refrigerator was gone, of course. But so was everything else. No distant traffic, no crickets outside my window, not even the faint buzz of the electrical grid. It felt deliberate, like the world was holding its breath. This wasn't just an absence of sound, it was an active, oppressive quiet. Then the figures became clearer. They were translucent, shimmering like heat haze on a summer road. They were human-shaped, but strangely incomplete, as if they were memories that hadn't finished loading. Some were missing limbs. Others had faces that were just smooth, blank surfaces. They moved slowly, drifting through my kitchen without making a sound. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The lights snapped back on with a sharp finality. The figures vanished in that instant. Everything looked normal. The kitchen was exactly as I'd left it. Except it wasn't. The chairs at my dining table had been turned to face the center of the room. A couple of cabinet doors were hanging open, and a framed photo on the counter. One of my parents was lying face down, and there was no damage. Nothing was broken. It was just rearranged. A quiet, unsettling demonstration. I knew the next blackout would come, and I was determined to be ready. I sat in my living room, phone in hand, camera app open, and ready to record. When the lights inevitably died, I jabbed at the screen. Nothing. The screen was black. My phone, which had a full battery just a second ago, was completely dead. No signal, no power, nothing. It was just as useless as everything else in the silent, dark house. That's when I heard the whispers. It wasn't one voice, but many, all overlapping and speaking at once. I couldn't make out any words, not really. It was more like hearing instructions from another room, muffled and indistinct. But I understood the intent. It was a single, unified command, a soft but insistent pressure in the air. Stay still. When the lights flashed back on this time, something was different. One of the shapes hadn't vanished completely. It was pressed into the wall next to the window, a shadow that remained even with all the lights on. It wasn't a shadow cast by anything. It was a mark made of darkness itself, a permanent stain on the plaster, shaped vaguely like a person recoiling in fear. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I saw my next-door neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, taking out her trash. I had to ask, "Have you ever," I started trying to sound casual, "noticed anything weird during the blackouts?" Her face went completely pale. She glanced around nervously, then leaned in close. "I stay in my closet," she whispered, her voice trembling. "As soon as the lights go, I get in the closet and I don't move. They don't like movement." She must have seen the disbelief on my face, because she pulled up the sleeve of her cardigan. Her arm was covered in bruises. They were perfectly shaped like fingerprints, like a hand had gripped her with impossible force. The skin was cold to the touch. "They move things," she said, her eyes wide with terror. "But they move people too, if you don't listen." I started watching. During the next few outages, I stayed perfectly still. Just like she said, the translucent figures would drift through my house, ignoring me. And I noticed something. They weren't acting on their own. They would all occasionally glance toward one specific corner of our street, down at the end of the block. They were waiting, listening, taking orders from something I couldn't see. The third blackout was the longest yet. Must have lasted a full 15 minutes. The figures came closer this time. I stayed frozen, watching as their featureless faces slowly began to form. What I saw there was terrifying. It was raw fear, deep, unending regret, and above all, a look of absolute terrified obedience. These spirits weren't the threat. They were prisoners, just like us. Then the main event started. Every single object in my house lifted about an inch off the ground. My couch, the TV, the books on the shelves, the forks in the drawer. Nothing was floating wildly. It was all suspended, held perfectly in place, trembling slightly. Everything was waiting for an instruction. And that's when it arrived. The darkness in the corner of my living room deepened. It wasn't a shape. It was an absence. A patch of reality where light simply refused to exist. It swallowed everything. A void that pulled at the edges of my vision. This wasn't a ghost. Ghosts are just leftovers, echoes of what once was. This was something else entirely. This was management. Understood what it wanted without it ever making a sound. Alignment. Perfect. Absolute order. Stillness. The world in its view was a messy, chaotic system full of errors. The greatest error of all was movement. The spirits, I realized, were its enforcers. Their job was to enforce the blackout, to keep people from moving, from noticing, from resisting the imposed order. I broke the rule. I don't know why. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe I just couldn't take it anymore. I took one step. Instantly, every spirit in the room rushed toward me. Their hands passed right through my body, and the cold was so intense it felt like burning. It was a pain that didn't hurt my skin, but my very soul. Then a voice spoke, not in the room, but inside my head. It was cold and genderless and utterly devoid of emotion. Motion causes error. The lights didn't just come back on. They exploded back into existence with a violent flash. Every object that had been suspended in the air dropped at once, creating a deafening crash. The silence was shattered. The cars outside, the hum of the fridge, the crickets, it all came rushing back. The next day, there was nothing. I checked the news, the utility company's website. No reports of a power surge, no logged outages. No official explanation for the collective chaos we had all experienced. It was as if it never happened, just like all the other times. Only now, the silence from the authorities felt more sinister. That's when I finally noticed the pattern. The outages only happened in the evenings when people were home from work, cooking dinner, watching TV. They never happened late at night, while everyone was asleep. And that detail was the most terrifying part. This thing, this entity, it needed witnesses. Its demand for compliance required our awareness. It wanted us to know we were being controlled. So now, when the power goes out, I have a new routine. I don't reach for a flashlight. I don't check my phone. I don't move a muscle. I don't even breathe too deeply. And the spirits, they recognize me now. They drift past my chair, sometimes so close I feel the chill, but they don't touch me. There's a strange sense of relief from them, like one less error they have to correct. So this is my warning to you. If your lights ever go out for no reason, and the silence that follows is just a little too perfect, don't move. Stay absolutely still, because they aren't haunting you. They're enforcing something. And darkness is how it arrives, quietly, briefly, and perfectly. Thanks for listening.